Hey everybody, I'm your host Chris Brady, back again with another WattWorks podcast episode brought to you by Edgecom Energy. Today I'm here with our VP of Distributed Energy Resources, Rob, and as far as the energy world gets, Rob's about as famous as you can get. He has quite the history, so I'll let him introduce himself and talk a little bit about that.
Okay, you throwing me for a loop, making me introduce myself. I've been in the energy industry for about 30 years. I've worked in Australia, the US, Canada, in deregulated markets since the late 1980s.
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say, coming into this, we're going to be talking about the ISO's introduction of MRP and other topics. So it's fair to say you've experienced a little bit of everything across the
spectrum, competitive markets, development of large-scale power plants, retail energy markets, the ups and downs of deregulation for the last 25 to 30 years.
Perfect. And I think for a lot of the people watching and a lot of manufacturers in Ontario, they're just starting to get into the world of what they're actually paying for when they get their electricity bills. So recently with the ISO dropping this market renewal program, I think it's throwing a lot of people for a loop. So if you could summarize that for everybody listening and explain what it is, why it's happening, I think that would be a great starting point.
Okay, well I think the first thing is that the market hasn't been modernized or realized and structurally changed since they decided to open it up to retail competition and even have a thing really which is commonly known as an ISO. So it's an effort to create more efficient, transparent, and competitive pricing. It's an effort to create opportunities for customers to reduce their costs. It reduces inefficiencies in the wholesale market. And also, I think, is an acknowledgement to the reality that renewable energy is here to stay and that we have to have it located in areas which make sense. Ontario has typically been characterized by large nuclear plants, large hydroelectric facilities. We're not decentralized, but we've got these centralized remote large generators, and I think there's an opportunity in the market to send better price signals.
Yeah, and so to kind of summarize that or paraphrase, so the market renewal program is an opportunity for more generation, more supply, more demand to be met in different ways.
Yes, in different ways. It's meant to encourage kind of localized and reward consumers for more demand side management, for local generation. And it's meant to create or make consumers more active participants. So maybe something we'll talk about is active participants versus passive participants.
Yeah, and I think easy one. Let's start with the passive participants. Let's say I'm a 1 megawatt manufacturer out in Waterloo, Ontario. What changes for me with the introduction of this program?
Well, the hourly Ontario energy price is going to change, and it's going to become the Ontario zonal price. And the Ontario zonal price is really a weighted average of all of the individual zonal prices. So that's a big change in the market. We've gone from a single zone to multiple zones on a real time and day ahead pricing perspective. So I think as a consumer, if you're an active consumer, then you're going to see you have an opportunity to access those local prices. If you're a passive consumer, you're going to get charged the weighted average.
Yeah, and if you have any projections, that weighted average, is it different than normal, or do you think status quo will stay relatively status quo?
That's a hard thing to predict. There's certainly articles around that would predict that the real-time price will become more volatile, less predictable. The day-ahead market will offer customers the opportunity at a more predictable price because you'll be able to secure that price 24 hours in advance. Is there going to be a delta between day-ahead and real-time? Generally in markets that can be $1 to $2 a megawatt hour, maybe as low as 50 cents, but there will be a difference over the long run between day-ahead and real-time.
Yeah, so I think in Ontario specifically, what that really opens up then is manufacturers that can be really flexible with their production can really start taking advantage of the day-ahead market.
Certainly that's a central tenet or pillar of market design, is that you want people that have flexible load to be able to take advantage of having that flexible load. So I think the introduction of the market renewal plan is really a game changer for people with flexible loads.
Interesting. And one thing I'd like to double down on, just speaking with manufacturers day in, day out, I feel a lot of them just started getting the hang of how Hope pricing worked. And now it's not getting done away with, but it's shifting the dynamic a bit. And so you mentioned now it's going to be Ontario zonal pricing. Is it still expected to behave in the same way Hope has historically? Will we see it be flatlined, or?
That's an interesting, again, we don't know for sure, and there's been very few studies put out by the ISO. However, some commentators would say that the Ontario energy price Hope has been very stable, very predictable. I think there are some that believe with the introduction of a day ahead in a real-time market is that you're going to see more volatility in the real-time market. So the whole idea is that there was a lot of, at a wholesale level, there was a lot of out-of-market payments that consumers didn't necessarily see, but they were paid to generators to cover congestion and various anomalies within the wholesale market as you went from kind of scheduling to actual production and meeting the real-time demand. So now if those costs are reflected in the hourly energy price, or in the zonal price, I should say, then there's an argument that it'll become less predictable and more volatile.
Yeah, and again, given your experience in so many other markets, what is the projection you see happening?
It's just that you'll see a delta, right? So generally in some markets, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but in other markets, consumers then had not a choice to choose even to buy from a retailer, which is not that common anymore in Ontario, but they could buy a day ahead index, or you could buy a real-time index. Most consumers, because the prices are determined on day ahead basis, would choose a day ahead index. Very few consumers want to remain in the real-time market given these changes. Absolutely.
And I guess leading into that, with the market renewal program, as a manufacturer, what are the biggest risks relative to the electricity grid we knew?
It's interesting because I'd anticipated you'd ask this question. And it's not so much risk that they take because of this weighted average zonal price for a passive user. In other words, somebody who chooses not to really participate in this market, but it's lost opportunity and I'll say relative competitive advantage. So if you're in a marketplace and you're competing with your competitors and they have flexible load, they can take advantage of market programs, load shifting, they can reduce their costs, versus as a passive load, you now risk taking on a little bit more of this real-time volatility. There's a factor called the load forecast deviation amount, which we won't necessarily get into the details of that, but that also will become higher on days of congestion, days of volatility in the marketplace. So again, a passive user has a greater risk of paying more, and they will most certainly pay more relative to somebody who's active in the market and taking advantage of the opportunities of MRP.
Yeah, and with all these volatile or variables, let's say, getting introduced, the existing pillars we see in, at least in Ontario, for example, the ICI program for global adjustment and demand response, etc. These programs that customers are currently using to get money, save money. Will MRP impact the financials of those programs heavily?
Not at all, actually. Right, at least at its inception, which is May 1st of this year, there's going to be no change to the construct of the global adjustment market. So I don't really see something like global adjustment, the construct, and how you deal with that changing. The one thing is that you do have an option to become a market responsive, I'm going to screw that up, but market price, market responsive price participant. So if you choose to do that, you'll actually pay your zonal price, but you won't pay the load forecast deviation amount. So again, none of us can really say what's going to happen, but the bias is towards becoming a market participant. The bias, the rules are to encourage you to take advantage of load shifting opportunities and ISO programs.
Yeah, and I think it's what's becoming very clear as well is it's more opportunity to participate and be flexible, right? It's not just one program to sign up for or one contract that you can go energy retail. It's those that are willing to see what's actually best for their facility and their operation can really manage their load are going to see cost reductions, and those that just play the market might see a raise, a fall, or nothing. And it's completely at the woes and whims of ISO and electricity usage.
Which brings up an interesting point of, what can you do to prepare? right? And so I think what consumers need to do, if they haven't already done that, is start with their data. And they need to better understand their load profile. They need to understand when they use energy on a daily, hourly, and even seasonal basis. And I think if they were to do that and engage, it'd likely take a software solution, some kind of energy management system. But if they can start to understand their load and maybe even looking at the sequencing of how they operate, then I think many consumers will find that they have an ability to shift load where they didn't think they did, previously had. And we're only going to see as time progresses an enhancement of the programs and the opportunities for consumers to really change from where energy becomes this just a cost. If you're a passive user, it's always a cost. And so is all your equipment that consumes energy. However, if you become an active participant in the market, you're going to shift that narrative slightly, and you're going to start to use some of that whole, I'll say dynamic silo becomes revenue generating for you.
Yeah, and it's interesting bringing up monitoring. It's crucial to have, we have a VP of sales here, Colin. He always has this saying, you can't manage what you don't measure. And it started off as a comedic bit within the company, but it's very true, and people are finally becoming conscious of the need for monitoring and actually caring and thinking just about even, again, the ISO programs. The amount of companies I've spoken to where they didn't participate in global adjustment reductions or demand response because they can't curtail, they can't do anything. They can do, they just didn't know what. And with all of these new segments and variables coming in, it's really forcing them to put an eye on it and say, okay, I do need to take a look at this. And I think the joy is, at least in Ontario, for those that I've experienced, they're going to have a pleasant surprise if they can actually do and save way more than they've ever put any effort to.
Well, I think you bring up an interesting point. We've talked about this. So that's been your experience. Maybe you could share a little bit of that experience you've had with consumers. You alluded to it just there for a second, but where you kind of get this initial pushback from customers that, I can't do anything. And yet when you spend some time with them, what have you been discovering?
Yeah, it's I think especially everybody is a victim of habit, right? Creatures of habit. And a lot of the times when we're in big manufacturing plants, they're thinking about their 24/7 production. They're saying, we have to deliver 25,000 car doors to Ford. And they're not thinking about the office staff that are upstairs, sitting in 17-degree HVAC, or all the lights that are running up there when they all have a work from home policy. And so a lot of the times in the last 3 customers I've brought on board, just having their office staff work from home a few times over the summer has already saved them 20% of their bill, right? So I think it's the not only just looking at what things are consuming and what we can do, but looking at the bigger picture rather than the specifics, right? So we work with a pork company, and immediately they're thinking, we work with livestock, we can't possibly shut this down, but well, you're also shaving the livestock, you're running other machines that aren't crucial to this pig's life, and those don't need to be on, right? And as silly as it sounds, when you help them take a step back and see that bigger picture, that's what opens up the world of opportunity. And I think where people like EdgeCom and like us come in is when we make the programs easy to understand, and then we bridge the accessibility from what their life looks like to what it could look like, it really starts to fall into place.
Well, and I think that's the game changer of MRP, right? And that's the intent of this reform, is to reward customers. Ultimately, where we see the market going is it will reward decentralized behavior. It'll reward people that can shift demand. So that's the intent. And then consumers that can integrate renewables, adopt energy storage, there will be greater and greater benefits as MRP progresses and more programs are rolled out to reward that behavior.
Absolutely. And as far as MRP goes, is there any misconceptions you hear going around that might have lost on people?
It's kind of interesting because there might be a narrative or that creates a misperception, which is I'm in a high congestion zone, so my prices are going to go up just because. Well, when they designed the market and they rolled it out, they decided to go with a weighted average zonal price. So if you do nothing, you're going to get the weighted average zonal price. So now you may actually see greater volatility. You may see your prices go up slightly relative to the people that participate in the day ahead market, because that's the structure of the market. But the perception that you live in a high congestion zone and so therefore you're going to pay more compared to someone in a low congestion zone, that's a misperception. I think the other tendency has been over the first 20 years of kind of deregulation and reform in Ontario is that that's kind of a wholesale thing. There's nothing in it for me. And I think just based on what we've talked about, you're seeing that there's going to be a whole host of opportunities for consumers to change how they look at consuming energy, right? For those that become active and a market participant, there will be rewards and there will be material benefit. For those that remain passive, I presume that you're at a minimum, you're going to be paying more for your energy than, let's say, your competitor down the road who's taken a different path.
Yeah, and I don't want to open up this can of worms too deep, but something I'd love for you to touch on is, do you think these changes are starting to pave the way for virtual power plants, VPPs?
It's all part of and parcel of the same kind of reform and technology. It's really being enabled by technology. It's being enabled by, I'll say, the continuing decrease in price of battery energy storage systems, of solar systems, of the desire perhaps of the government to get out of the business of offering long-term guaranteed contracts. So there's a movement, I'll say, where I'll say the regulators, the government are looking for ways that generators can get certainty, and how do you facilitate that? And one way is virtual power plants. It's also through virtual net metering, which is something that will likely be introduced in Ontario. So it's all sort of based on a future construct of renewable energy placed where it's best suited, battery energy storage, which is going to affect our ability to shift load and reduce peak demand, which is critical for the, I'll say, reliability and resiliency of the electric system. So it does start to just create an environment where virtual power plants will become something that I think consumers are more familiar with.
Yeah, and it's interesting for me personally. I noticed, a lot of the talk has changed from getting more generation into, well, let's manage the demand we have, right? And like you said, batteries getting cheaper, solar getting more accessible. There's certainly a large market for VPPs, especially when you start thinking about all the land up in northern Ontario that we don't even use, right? And if we can connect it somehow, it really serves to lower our costs.
It does. It encourages renewable development, so it gives customers credit behind their bill. So what does a virtual power plant do? We probably haven't even really talked about that. And so that the construct allows a customer to take power under a long-term power purchase agreement from a remote generator, let's say a renewable one, because that's really the only ones that are being encouraged in that program, and they get credit at their meter as if they had consumed that energy on site, as opposed to that it was generated remotely. Now, the one thing that VPPs don't do is congestion, right? And so we need mechanisms, and that's really where the MRP comes in, is we need generation and demand response assets put in place where we have congestion, which in a lot of cases is in tight urban areas. So VPPs are a very interesting construct from a renewable perspective and from encouraging generation to be built, but they don't necessarily solve our congestion problem, and that's where MRP comes in to try and look at a more localized level.
Yeah, and so I guess talking about the short-term evolution of MRP, how do you think it will help with the congestion?
I think that what it's doing is it's just creating the programs, or it's creating incentives, right? So if you have a flexible load, so let's go back to that concept, and I just hit my mic, but let's go back to that concept of where you can, as a flexible load, you can take ahead of price predictability, price certainty, you can shift your demand, you can choose to consume or schedule your load when prices are favorable. So if you're putting in energy storage, solar isn't quite the same because it generates when the sun shines, but let's say if you put in battery energy storage, for example, then you have this ability to shift your load. Now you're not only contributing to reducing, I'll say, peak demand, congestion, you're also taking advantage of favorable pricing at the time. So MRP becomes, I'll say, very focused in a way from a congestion perspective on demand response, energy storage, and maybe to a lesser degree, things like solar, rooftop solar.
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say at the end of the day, what the MRP is really doing is paving the framework for the future and giving more opportunity to those that are willing to be active participants.
Yes, absolutely.
And step one of that is monitoring, figuring out what you're actually consuming, why you're consuming, and then getting into the woods with how you can shift that.
Yes, I think measurement's one thing, but I think consumers should reach out to companies that not only are engaged in EMS, but engaged in the market and understand the programs. I think that combination of the two will allow customers to understand kind of what their options are, whether it makes sense for them to do it, and is it cost effective?
For sure. And I think, we've gone over a lot of MRP and even touched on things like virtual power plants, which are not always a great idea to get into on a podcast that's time limited. But with that being said, is there anything else you wanted to touch on personally that you feel that maybe Ontario energy consumers should know, or any market ideas that could be coming in the future?
It's an interesting point. The government, the ISO in particular, has been looking at what they call dynamic Class B pricing. So one of the issues is if you're essentially under a megawatt right now, you're not considered in an Ontario context Class A ICI, you're considered Class B. Class B has had the global adjustment, which is really a big giant demand charge, charged on a volumetric basis. So it's based on your volume consumed, dollars per kilowatt hour. So the only way you can control your demand charge is by using less, conserving. Dynamic Class B pricing is going to introduce potentially the concept where they're going to split the energy cost and the GA, much like the Class A, and you'll have an opportunity now on a daily basis to affect, by shifting load, you'll be able to reduce the amount of your exposure to global adjustment. So that's kind of an exciting thing that's coming up, and I think for the larger Class B customers, it's been a frustration that they haven't had an ability to manage that global adjustment or do anything to affect it in any material way. So I think the expansion, or also the evolution of battery technology, I'll say the affordability of solar is going to change that, and then those are the market side. Then on the regulatory side, you need the construct to allow them to take advantage of it. So the dynamic Class B is probably the most interesting one for me.
Yeah, I agree, especially when you consider that a large majority of Ontario's grid demand actually comes from Class B consumers, right? So when you can start enabling them to participate in anything, it opens it up. That is the biggest gripe for me as well, is these manufacturers and even large residential or condo buildings where they're running at 300, 400, 500 kilowatts, but they don't meet the next code or whatever requirements to participate, and they're ready when the time comes, but there's no incentive for them right now. And I think it'll definitely pave a lot of that demand management incentive. But Rob, I appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise today. And for everybody watching, if there's any additional questions, our website is absolutely filled to the brim with content to answer anything you might have. And somebody from our team's always willing to help out. If you have any questions, you can reach out. I'm Chris. Thank you guys for joining the WattWorks podcast.